never thought I'd be sitting here, talking into a camera, sharing the darkest chapter of my life with strangers. But sometimes, the most unexpected stories need to be told. My name is Eleanor Harrington. For over 40 years, I was known in Westfield, Connecticut as the respected professor's wife, the community volunteer, the woman who organized the church fundraisers and hosted the most elegant Christmas parties on Maple Avenue. That was before Victoria entered our lives and systematically destroyed everything I had built. I still remember the day my son Daniel brought her home. She was stunning, tall, with perfect blonde hair and a smile that could charm anyone. "Mom, this is Victoria," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. I noticed how he looked at her, like she held the moon and stars in her hands. I was happy for him. After his difficult divorce, seeing him in love again warmed my heart. I welcomed her with open arms, preparing her favorite meals, offering my late mother's jewelry for their wedding. I wanted so desperately for her to feel like family. The first incident happened 3 months after their wedding. We were having Sunday dinner at the Harrington estate, the colonial home that had been in our family for generations. I had set the table with the antique china that Charles, my late husband, and I had collected over our 38 years of marriage. Victoria picked up a plate, examined it with a slight grimace, and said, "Don't you think it's time to upgrade from these outdated pieces? They look like something from a thrift store." The table fell silent. My son cleared his throat but said nothing. I laughed it off, thinking she was just nervous, still finding her place in the family. "These plates have history," I said gently. "Each one has a story." Victoria placed the plate down with noticeable force. "History belongs in museums, Eleanor, not on dining tables." The way she said my name, not Mom or even Mrs. Harrington, felt like a deliberate boundary being set. But what disturbed me more was the look that passed between her and Daniel, a subtle nod from him, an almost imperceptible smile from her, like they had shared a private joke at my expense. I dismissed it as an isolated incident. But then it happened again at the Westfield Country Club during their annual spring luncheon. I was mid-conversation with Margaret Collins, my closest friend since college, discussing the latest book from our reading group. Victoria approached with a group of younger women from her social circle. Eleanor was just telling us about her outdated book choices. Victoria interrupted, placing her hand on my shoulder. "She still reads physical books, can you believe it? So quaint and old-fashioned." The women tittered politely while Margaret looked uncomfortable. I felt a flush creep up my neck as Victoria continued. "We've been trying to introduce her to this century, but you know how the elderly struggle with technology." I was 65, hardly elderly, and I owned an e-reader that Charles had given me before he passed. Victoria knew this. She had seen me use it countless times, but facts didn't matter in her narrative. Daniel joined us then, champagne flute in hand. "What are we talking about?" he asked cheerfully. "Just your mother's resistance to joining the modern world," Victoria replied, slipping her arm through his. I looked at my son expectantly, waiting for him to correct her, to defend me in some small way. Instead, he chuckled and said, "Mom's always been set in her ways." That moment crystallized something for me. This wasn't just Victoria. My own son was complicit in my humiliation. The realization felt like ice water in my veins. The incidents multiplied after that. At family gatherings, Victoria would loudly correct my recipes in front of guests. During holiday dinners, she would rearrange my table settings, claiming they weren't properly done. At church socials, she would interrupt my conversations, explaining what I really meant as if I were a child, incapable of expressing myself. Each time, Daniel would watch with that same strange satisfaction. Sometimes he would add his own barbs. "Mom never did understand proper etiquette," or "You'll have to excuse my mother, she's from a different era." The dynamic was excruciating. For years, I had been respected in our community. I had taught literature at Westfield College for 3 decades. I had published books. I had raised funds for libraries and schools. Now, I was being recast as doddering and incompetent, all while my son nodded in agreement. The worst moments happened at the Harrington estate itself. Victoria gradually rearranged the home where I had lived for 40 years, replacing family heirlooms with modern pieces, relegating my belongings to the attic, or donating them without my permission. "This house needed a woman's touch," she would say, within earshot of guests, as if I hadn't been that woman for decades. When I objected once, trying to save a writing desk that had belonged to Charles, Victoria waited until we had company, the Petersons from next door and the Montgomerys from church, before addressing it. "Eleanor," she said loudly during dinner, "about that hideous desk you're so attached to. We're having it removed tomorrow. The decorator says it's bringing down the value of the entire room." Samantha Peterson nearly choked on her wine. Dr. Montgomery studied his plate intently. "That desk was Charles's," I said quietly. "He wrote all his lectures there." Victoria's smile was razor sharp. "And Charles has been gone for what, 5 years now? Time to let go of the past, don't you think?" She turned to Daniel. "Darling, back me up here." My son placed his fork down deliberately. "Victoria's right, Mom. The house needs updating. You can't turn it into a shrine." I felt tears threatening but refused to give them the satisfaction. Charles hadn't even been gone for 5 years. It had been 3 years and 4 months. Victoria knew this. Daniel knew this. They were deliberately misrepresenting my grief to make me appear pathetic. Later that night, I overheard them laughing in their bedroom. "Did you see her face?" Victoria said. "I thought she might actually cry this time." "She needs to understand that this is our house now," Daniel replied. "She's lucky we let her stay." Lucky, as if the home I had maintained for 40 years, that had been in the Harrington family for generations, was suddenly theirs to bestow or withhold, as if I were a guest in my own life. The humiliations continued in public and private. At Olivia's 16th birthday party, Victoria announced to everyone that I would be transitioning to assisted living soon, something never discussed with me. At the Christmas charity event, she loudly criticized my donation amount as typical of her generation, always thinking small. During a family vacation to the Berkshires, she accidentally left me at a rest stop for 2 hours, later laughing about how I looked like a lost child when they finally returned. Through it all, Daniel watched. Sometimes he joined in, sometimes he merely observed, but he never, not once, defended me. The little boy I had raised, who once brought me wildflowers from the garden and wrote me poems on Mother's Day, now took pleasure in watching me squirm under his wife's cruelty. I began to withdraw. I stopped attending social functions. I took my meals in my room. I visited Charles's grave more frequently, talking to him about what our son had become. I lost weight. My hands developed a tremor. Margaret noticed and begged me to stand up for myself. But what could I do? Where would I go at my age? Then came that rainy Tuesday last April. We were having a family dinner to commemorate Charles's birthday. I had placed his photograph on the mantel with white roses, his favorite. Victoria walked in, spotted the arrangement, and made a beeline for it. She picked up the silver frame, examining it with exaggerated concern. "You know," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I've been going through some of the old financial records. Did everyone know that Charles left this family nearly bankrupt? All that academic prestige, and he couldn't even manage a basic investment portfolio." The room went silent. This wasn't just an attack on my age or my tastes. This was an assault on Charles's memory, on our life together. And it was a complete lie. Charles had been meticulous with our finances, leaving us well provided for. I looked to Daniel, certain that even he would draw the line at disparaging his father's memory so falsely. Instead, he nodded solemnly. "Victoria's been helping me sort out the mess Dad left behind. It's been enlightening." Something snapped inside me in that moment. A lifetime of politeness, of accommodation, of maternal sacrifice. It all crumbled away. I realized with perfect clarity that I had been playing by rules that they had long abandoned. Civility meant nothing to them. Family loyalty was a foreign concept. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at my window overlooking the gardens Charles and I had planted together. Rain streamed down the glass, mirroring the tears on my face. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage, of resolution. With hands that had stopped trembling for the first time in months, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. "Thomas," I said when the bank manager answered, his voice concerned at the late hour. "I need to discuss some financial arrangements. Privately. First thing tomorrow." There was a pause on the line. Thomas Reynolds had been our family's banker for 20 years. He had attended Charles's funeral. He had seen the transformation in me since Victoria's arrival. "Is everything all right, Eleanor?" he asked cautiously. I watched lightning illuminate the garden where Charles and I had spent countless summer evenings, where Daniel had taken his first steps, where Victoria now planned to install a modern sculpture garden, erasing more of our history. "No, Thomas, everything is not all right," I replied, "but it will be." The humiliation started small, as these things often do. Like water dripping on stone, Victoria's cruelty was constant, methodical, and designed to wear me down over time. In the beginning, I convinced myself I was being oversensitive. Perhaps her comments about my outdated table settings were well-intentioned. Maybe when she corrected my pronunciation of foreign dishes at dinner parties, she truly thought she was helping. But deep down, I recognized the calculated glint in her eye each time she diminished me. I remember distinctly the first time I realized this was a pattern rather than isolated incidents. It was during a Sunday brunch at the Harrington estate. About 4 months after she and Daniel had married, I had prepared my special blueberry scones, a recipe passed down from my grandmother that had always been Daniel's favorite as a child. Victoria took one bite, wrinkled her nose, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, Eleanor, these are interesting. In Manhattan, we prefer our pastries a bit less rustic." The word rustic hung in the air like a slur. My brother-in-law shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His wife suddenly became very interested in her napkin, but it was Daniel's reaction that cut deepest. He laughed. Not the uncomfortable laugh of someone trying to diffuse tension, but a genuine chuckle of amusement. "Mom still thinks baking is about taste rather than presentation," he added, smiling at Victoria with complicity. Later that afternoon, after the guests had left, I found the remainder of my scones in the trash, not even saved for later or offered to be taken home, simply discarded. Something so small, yet it felt like a dagger to my heart. 40 years of baking those scones for my family, gone in an instant because they didn't meet Victoria's cosmopolitan standards. These minor cruelties graduated to public humiliations with remarkable speed. At the Westfield Country Club's annual summer gala, I wore a pale blue dress I'd purchased for the occasion. Nothing extravagant, but elegant and appropriate. I had even visited Marianne at the salon to have my hair styled specially. For the first time since Charles passed, I felt a glimmer of my former self. Victoria spotted me across the room, exchanged whispers with her circle of younger friends, and then approached with calculated timing, just as several board members of the Westfield Historical Society, where I had volunteered for years, came within earshot. "Eleanor, darling," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Didn't Daniel tell you we were dressing formally tonight? That outfit looks more suited to a casual luncheon." She turned to the group. "My mother-in-law struggles with appropriate attire. We're working on it, aren't we?" I felt my cheeks burning as I glanced around the room. My dress was perfectly appropriate. Many women were dressed similarly. This wasn't about my clothing. It was about publicly establishing her dominance. The Historical Society director, Catherine Blackwell, gave me a sympathetic look but said nothing. No one ever said anything. Daniel appeared with drinks, handing one to Victoria and none for me. "What are we discussing?" he asked cheerfully. "Just giving your mother some fashion advice," Victoria replied, taking his arm possessively. "Ah," he nodded, looking at my dress with newly critical eyes. "Mom's never been one for following trends." The betrayal stung fresh each time. This was my son, the boy who once cried when neighborhood children had mocked my accent, a remnant of my Boston upbringing that occasionally slipped through. Now he was not only allowing his wife to ridicule me, but actively participating. After Charles died, Daniel had been my rock. For nearly a year he called daily, visited weekly, and ensured I wasn't drowning in grief. We had always been close, perhaps too close, as his first wife had once suggested. When that marriage ended, I blamed myself somewhat. Had I been too involved? Too protective? These questions haunted me, which is why I tried so hard with Victoria. I wanted to prove I could be the perfect mother-in-law, supportive but not intrusive, loving but not possessive. My efforts made no difference. If anything, my attempts to accommodate her seemed to fuel Victoria's disdain. When I offered my mother's pearl necklace as her something borrowed for the wedding, She examined it like a curator assessing a forgery before declaring it too provincial for her Vera Wang gown. When I suggested hosting a small dinner for their first anniversary, she informed me they would be dining at Le Bernardin in New York instead, somewhere with a proper chef. Each slight was followed by that look between them, Victoria seeking validation, Daniel providing it with a nod or smile, or worse, adding his own barb to deepen the wound. The pattern extended beyond social occasions into the very fabric of daily life at the Harrington estate. Though the house had been in my family for generations, Victoria began renovating without consultation. My gardening room, where I had spent peaceful hours tending to orchids Charles had given me, was converted into a home gym. The library, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves containing first editions my father-in-law had collected, was modernized with minimalist furniture and most of the books removed to storage. "Books gather dust," Victoria explained when I discovered the library's transformation. "Besides, everything's digital now. Only the elderly cling to paper." There was that word again, elderly. At 65, I was active and healthy. I volunteered, maintained correspondence with former colleagues, and kept up with current literature. Yet Victoria persistently characterized me as decrepit, one step away from complete senility. The most painful changes involved Charles's presence in the home. Photographs of him gradually disappeared from mantels and walls. His office, which I had preserved with his academic papers and mementos, was redesigned as Victoria's meditation space. When I objected, Daniel took me aside. "Mom, it's been 3 years," he said, as if grief had an expiration date. "Victoria finds it depressing to live in a mausoleum." "This isn't a mausoleum," I replied, my voice breaking. "This is our home. Your father built this life with me." Daniel's expression hardened in a way I'd never seen before. "It's our home now, Victoria's and mine. You're living here because we allow it." The words struck like physical blows. The house had been left to both of us in Charles's will, with the understanding that it would remain my home for life. Daniel had never expressed any desire to live here until Victoria came along. Suddenly, they needed the estate for entertaining, for establishing their social position in Westfield, and I had been reclassified from matriarch to tenant, existing on their sufferance. Victoria's humiliations became more targeted, more personal as time went on. At a faculty retirement party for my former colleague at Westfield College, she loudly interrupted my conversation with the department chair. "Eleanor was just telling us about her teaching days," she announced to the group. So quaint how education worked before modern standards. Apparently, they just let anyone stand in front of a classroom back then. The department chair, my friend of 30 years, looked mortified. I had been one of the most published professors in the English department, had received teaching awards, had mentored dozens of students who went on to distinguished careers. Victoria knew this. She had seen my citations, my books on the library shelves, the letters from former students that still arrived at Christmas. Yet she deliberately painted me as some relic of a less professional era. And Daniel, standing beside her with a champagne flute, added, "Mom's stories from the old days of academia are something else. The old days. I had retired just 5 years earlier. These public humiliations were difficult, but the private ones cut deeper. Victoria had a talent for waiting until we were alone to deliver her most venomous comments. One evening, finding me looking through a photo album in the sitting room, she paused in the doorway. "You know why Daniel married me?" she asked conversationally. I looked up, surprised by the sudden question. "Because I'm nothing like you," she continued, her voice soft but sharp. "He told me how suffocated he felt, growing up with your expectations, your neediness after Charles died. He said marrying me was like finally being able to breathe." I felt physically ill at her words. Had Daniel really said these things? Was this how he truly felt? The doubt she planted took root and grew, poisoning my memories of our relationship. Another time, after I had spent the afternoon with my granddaughter Olivia, helping with her English essay, Victoria cornered me in the kitchen. "Olivia told me you tried to help with her homework," she said, loading the dishwasher with deliberate movements. I had to explain to her that educational methods have changed since the Dark Ages. "I've arranged for a proper tutor, someone with current credentials." The dismissal of my academic career was one thing, but interfering with my relationship with Olivia was another level of cruelty. Olivia and I had always been close. She loved literature as I did, often borrowing books from what remained of the library collection. Victoria seemed determined to sever this connection too. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of these years was how Victoria isolated me from my support system. When Margaret Collins called to invite me to our monthly book club, Victoria would intercept the call and make excuses for my absence. When invitations arrived for community events where I had once been a fixture, they would mysteriously disappear from the mail table. My world gradually shrank to the confines of the Harrington estate, and even there, I was made to feel unwelcome. I began taking meals in my room more frequently, claiming mild headaches or fatigue to avoid another dinner of subtle barbs and exclusionary conversations. Victoria and Daniel would discuss trips they were planning, parties they would attend, decisions about the house, all without including me, even when I sat at the same table. If I offered an opinion, Victoria would exchange that look with Daniel, and he would gently explain why my thoughts were irrelevant. "Mom, the landscaper needs someone who understands modern garden design. Your ideas are a bit traditional. Mom, the charity board is looking for members with fresh perspectives. Maybe sit this one out. Mom, Victoria and I are handling the investments now. You don't need to worry about financial matters." But I did worry. Increasingly, I noticed references to expenditures that seemed excessive, even for our comfortable means. Victoria's shopping trips to New York resulted in closets overflowing with designer clothes. Their weekend getaways involved private jets rather than commercial flights. The renovations to the house employed architects and designers whose names appeared in glossy magazines. When I tentatively raised the question of budget during a rare moment alone with Daniel, his response was dismissive. "Victoria knows what she's doing. She has friends in finance. Besides, it's our money now." Our money. As if the careful investments Charles and I had built over decades belonged solely to them. As if my financial security was an afterthought rather than a priority. The realization that Victoria might be mismanaging our family's resources added a new dimension to my growing unease. It wasn't just emotional cruelty anymore. There could be practical consequences that would affect all our futures. But whenever I tried to access financial documents or speak with our family accountant, I was blocked. "Eleanor's been a bit confused lately," Victoria would tell Mr. Jacobson when I called his office. "Daniel and I are managing everything now. The implication of cognitive decline was particularly effective at undermining me. Once planted, the seed of doubt was difficult to remove. Even old friends began looking at me differently, watching for signs of confusion or memory loss that weren't there. My isolation deepened. I spent more time in my room, reviewing the mental catalog of humiliations, trying to understand how my life had unraveled so completely. The vibrant, respected woman I had been seemed like a distant memory. In her place was this diminished version, tiptoeing around her own home, flinching at the sound of Victoria's voice, grieving the loss of her son's loyalty. I might have continued this way indefinitely, gradually fading into the background of my own life, if not for that rainy Tuesday in April and Victoria's attack on Charles's memory. There are some provocations that cut too deep to ignore, some lies that demand correction. Charles had been meticulous about our finances. A professor's salary might not make one wealthy, but his family had old money, carefully preserved through conservative investments. Additionally, Charles had written several textbooks that continued to generate royalties. We had lived well but not extravagantly, prioritizing security over flash. The idea that he had left us nearly bankrupt was not just false but malicious, a deliberate attempt to rewrite our history. As I sat by my window that night, phone in hand after calling Thomas at the bank, I felt something hardening within me. The tears on my face were drying, replaced by a cold clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Victoria had miscalculated. By attacking Charles, she had awakened something in me that her previous cruelties hadn't reached. A fierce protectiveness not just for myself, but for the truth of the life Charles and I had built together. I realized then that I had been complicit in my own humiliation through my silence. By absorbing each slight without response, I had tacitly agreed to Victoria's characterization of me as feeble and irrelevant. By retreating from confrontation, I had ceded ground that should never have been surrendered. No more, I decided. The time for passive endurance had passed. As lightning illuminated the garden where Charles and I had spent so many happy evenings, I began to formulate a plan. Victoria thought me technologically inept, financially naive, socially irrelevant. Her confidence in these assumptions would be her undoing. "No, Thomas, everything is not all right," I had told the bank manager. "But it will be." For the first time in years, I felt something like anticipation rather than dread when thinking about the days ahead. Victoria had taught me much about cruelty during our years together. Now it was time to show her what I had learned about revenge. I arrived at First National Trust precisely at 9:20 a.m. the next morning, dressed in one of my better suits, a navy ensemble that Charles had always said brought out the blue in my eyes. Thomas Reynolds was waiting for me, concern evident in the creases around his eyes. He'd known our family for over 20 years, had handled Charles's estate after his passing, and had watched from a professional distance as Victoria entered our lives. "Eleanor," he greeted me, rising from behind his desk. "Please, sit down. Can I get you some coffee?" "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, settling into the leather chair across from him. "Black, no sugar." As he poured from the carafe on his credenza, I noticed his hands, steady, reliable hands that had guided countless clients through financial decisions both mundane and momentous. Thomas had been Charles's confidant in many ways, their friendship extending beyond banking to fishing trips and chess games. After Charles died, Thomas had continued to treat me with the same respect and consideration, never once suggesting that I needed male guidance to manage my affairs. "I was surprised by your call last night," he said, placing the coffee before me. "Is everything all right at home?" The question was loaded. Thomas had met Victoria on several occasions, had witnessed her dismissive attitude toward me during meetings about family finances. He was too professional to voice disapproval, but I'd caught the tightening around his mouth when Victoria interrupted me or spoke about me in the third person, as if I weren't present. "No, Thomas, it isn't," I admitted, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "And it hasn't been for some time." What followed was a conversation unlike any I'd had since Charles's death. For nearly 2 hours, I unburdened myself, detailing the systematic campaign of humiliation Victoria had waged with my son's complicity. I described the isolation, the public mockery, the private undermining of my confidence. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "But last night crossed a line," I concluded, my voice steady despite the emotion behind my words. "Victoria lied about Charles's financial management. She told everyone he left us nearly bankrupt. You know that's not true." Thomas's jaw tightened. "It's categorically false. Charles was one of the most prudent investors I've ever worked with. Conservative, yes, but extremely effective at preserving and growing capital." "That's what I thought," I nodded. "But Daniel supported her claim, and it made me wonder, what else might they be doing with our family's resources that I don't know about?" Thomas hesitated, professional discretion warring with evident concern. "Eleanor, I can't discuss other account holders' activities without proper authorization or legal orders." "I understand," I replied, "but I do have questions about my own accounts, the ones in my name alone." After Charles's death, as part of his estate planning, certain assets had been placed solely in my name, a measure he'd insisted upon to ensure my security, regardless of what Daniel might do in the future. Charles had always been forward-thinking, pragmatic about human nature, in a way I sometimes wasn't. "Those accounts are, of course, entirely at your disposal," Thomas confirmed, "and they remain substantial." "How substantial?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. Thomas pulled up the information on his computer, turning the screen so I could see the numbers. Despite Victoria's insinuations about our finances, the truth was illuminating. My personal accounts held significantly more than I'd realized. Charles had been quietly transferring additional funds before his illness progressed, creating a safety net I hadn't known existed. "Charles never told me," I whispered, emotion threatening to break through my composure. "He wanted to surprise you once everything was settled," Thomas explained gently. "He called it your independence fund, said every woman should have the means to chart her own course if necessary." A tear escaped despite my best efforts. Charles had known. Somehow he had anticipated that I might need protection, not just from financial hardship, but from our own son. The realization was both heartbreaking and fortifying. "There's something else," Thomas added, his voice dropping slightly, though we were alone in his office. "I've been concerned about some transaction patterns in the family trust accounts." This was dangerous territory for a banker, discussing accounts for which I wasn't the sole signatory. But Thomas's loyalty to Charles's memory apparently outweighed standard protocol. "What kind of patterns?" I asked. "Unusual withdrawals. Investment changes that don't align with the conservative strategy Charles established. Property purchases in the Hamptons and Aspen under separate LLCs." He paused. "I've tried raising these concerns with Daniel, but Victoria usually intercepts these conversations, claims that they're modernizing the portfolio." The picture becoming clearer made my blood run cold. Not content with humiliating me and erasing Charles's memory from our home, Victoria appeared to be systematically draining the family resources meant to last generations, to support Olivia's education and future. "What can I do?" I asked, my mind already racing with possibilities. "Legally, without Daniel's cooperation, your options regarding the joint accounts are limited," Thomas admitted. "But your personal accounts are different, and there are other measures." What followed was a crash course in financial self-defense. Thomas outlined steps I could take to protect my assets, monitor the family accounts without arousing suspicion, and document any potentially fraudulent activity. He recommended Richard Kingsley, an attorney specializing in estate litigation and financial elder abuse, a term that made me wince, but accurately described Victoria's systematic isolation and manipulation. "I'm not elderly," I protested weakly. Thomas's smile was sad. "No, you're not. But Victoria's been working hard to create that perception, hasn't she? Making others believe you're confused, out of touch, unable to manage your affairs." The strategy was suddenly transparent. Victoria's constant references to my age, her implications of cognitive decline, her efforts to separate me from friends and community activities. She was constructing a narrative that would allow her to seize control of everything, possibly even have me declared incompetent. As our meeting concluded, Thomas walked me to the bank's side entrance, a courtesy that also allowed me to exit without potentially being seen by other Westfield residents who might report my activities to Victoria. "Eleanor," he said as we paused at the door, "Charles would be proud of you for taking this stand. He always said you were stronger than you knew." I squared my shoulders, feeling more like myself than I had in years. "Thank you, Thomas. I believe I'm about to prove him right." The following weeks transformed me in ways I couldn't have imagined. I moved through the Harrington estate like a ghost, maintaining the facade of the defeated, submissive mother-in-law while secretly building my case. I purchased a small safe that I concealed in my closet behind hat boxes Victoria would never deign to touch. Inside, I began collecting evidence, bank statements Thomas discreetly provided, notes documenting each incident of humiliation or manipulation, recordings of conversations made on a device Richard Kingsley had given me. "Connecticut is a one-party consent state for recordings," he'd explained during our first meeting in his wood-paneled office in downtown Westfield. "As long as you're part of the conversation, you can legally record it without informing the other participants." Richard was in his late 50s, with silver hair and the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen every type of family betrayal imaginable. He'd been skeptical at first, another aging mother complaining about a daughter-in-law, but the evidence I'd already gathered quickly convinced him otherwise. "This isn't just family friction, Mrs. Harrington," he said after reviewing my documentation. "This appears to be a coordinated effort to isolate you, diminish your standing, and potentially gain control of assets that rightfully belong to you. And to erase Charles," I added quietly. "To erase our life together as if it meant nothing." Richard's expression softened momentarily. "That part isn't illegal, unfortunately. But the financial aspects, those we can fight with the full force of the law." Our strategy unfolded on multiple fronts. While I continued gathering evidence at home, Richard investigated Victoria's background, discovering discrepancies that raised serious questions about her past. Thomas monitored the family accounts, documenting every questionable transaction for future legal action, and I began quietly reconnecting with old friends and colleagues, rebuilding the support network Victoria had systematically dismantled. The most difficult reconnection was with Margaret Collins, my oldest friend, who had gradually been pushed away by Victoria's interference. I called her from a burner phone Richard had provided, arranging to meet at a small cafe in neighboring Fairfield, where we were unlikely to be recognized. When Margaret saw me, her eyes widened in shock. "Eleanor, you've lost so much weight. Are you ill?" The concern in her voice nearly broke my composure. How long had it been since anyone had shown genuine care for my well-being? "Not ill," I assured her. "Just under siege." Over the next 2 hours, I shared everything. Victoria's cruelty, Daniel's betrayal, the financial machinations I was uncovering. Margaret listened with growing horror, occasionally reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "The way you gradually stopped returning calls, canceled our book club appearances. Victoria always had some excuse why you couldn't come to the phone, but I never imagined it was this systematic. She's very clever," I acknowledged. "She built the narrative so gradually that even I started to believe it, that I was becoming forgetful, that my social withdrawal was natural with age, that I should be grateful they allowed me to remain in the home." Margaret's expression hardened, my gentle friend who rarely showed anger. "What can I do to help?" Her offer became the first thread in a tapestry of support I began weaving around myself. Margaret helped me reconnect with other friends who had been similarly pushed away. My former department chair at Westfield College, Dr. Eleanor Montgomery, no relation but a longtime ally, offered her expertise in psychology to help document the emotional abuse. Samantha Peters, our neighbor whose gossipy nature I had once found tiresome, became an unlikely asset, reporting back on Victoria's activities when I couldn't monitor them myself. The most unexpected ally emerged in my granddaughter Olivia. At 16, she possessed remarkable perception and a moral compass that somehow remained true despite her parents' influence. One afternoon, she found me in the garden, tending to roses that had miraculously survived Victoria's landscaping purge. "Grandma," she said, dropping onto the bench beside me, "is everything okay with you? You seem different lately." I regarded her carefully, uncertain how much to share. Olivia was perceptive, but she was still a child caught between loyalty to her parents and concern for her grandmother. "I'm managing," I replied cautiously. She frowned, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear, a gesture so reminiscent of Daniel at her age that it made my heart ache. "Mom says you're getting confused a lot, that you might need special care soon." Her voice wavered, "But that doesn't seem right to me. You're always completely clear when we talk about my books or help with my essays." The manipulation extended even to Olivia. Victoria was planting seeds of doubt about my competence in my own granddaughter's mind. The realization strengthened my resolve. "Olivia," I said carefully, "sometimes people see what they expect to see, rather than what's truly there." Her blue eyes, Charles's eyes, studied me intently. "She's lying about you, isn't she?" I neither confirmed nor denied, knowing the impossible position it would put her in. Instead, I changed the subject, asking about her latest English assignment. But something had shifted between us, an unspoken understanding that things in the Harrington household were not as they appeared. After that conversation, Olivia began spending more time with me, often bringing her homework to my sitting room rather than working in the main library where Victoria held court. Occasionally, she would mention odd financial discussions she'd overheard between her parents, references to offshore accounts, concerns about liquidity problems, arguments about spending that stopped abruptly when they realized she was within earshot. Each detail I carefully recorded and passed to Richard and Thomas, pieces in a puzzle that was beginning to form a disturbing picture of Victoria's true intentions. The breaking point approached more rapidly than I had anticipated. Victoria, perhaps sensing my subtle resistance, escalated her efforts to undermine me. The Charles' birthday dinner incident had been the opening salvo in a new campaign targeting not just my dignity, but my very presence in the home. "We've been thinking," she announced at breakfast one morning, Daniel beside her looking uncomfortable but determined, The East Wing would make a perfect yoga studio and meditation space. Those rooms are just sitting empty now. The East Wing contained my bedroom, sitting room, and private bath, the only spaces in the house still truly mine, where Charles's books still lined shelves and his photographs still occupied bedside tables. "My rooms are not empty," I replied calmly, buttering my toast with deliberate movements. "I use them daily." Victoria's smile was predatory. "Well, you hardly need so much space, Eleanor. We found a lovely little apartment in the Westfield Seniors Village, so much more manageable for someone your age." Daniel cleared his throat. "It's really nice, Mom. Great activities, people your own age." "My own age," I repeated. "You mean people in their 60s? Hardly 1 foot in the grave, Daniel." Victoria's expression hardened briefly before she recovered her saccharine smile. "We've already put down a deposit. They have an opening next month. We can start moving your essential items next week." They had planned my expulsion from my own home without even consulting me. The apartment wasn't an offer. It was a fate already determined. In that moment, I understood that my timeline had accelerated. Whatever Victoria was planning financially, she needed me removed from the house to complete it. "How thoughtful," I murmured, rising from the table. "If you'll excuse me, I have some correspondence to attend to." In my room, hands shaking with suppressed rage, I called Richard immediately. "They're trying to move me out," I explained quickly. "Some retirement facility. They've already paid a deposit." "This changes things," Richard said after a moment's consideration. "We need to move up our timeline. Can you come to my office today? Bring everything you've gathered so far." As I hung up, I caught sight of my reflection in the vanity mirror, a woman transformed not by age, but by determination, eyes clear and focused. Victoria had made a critical error in her campaign against me. By escalating too quickly, too boldly, she had forced my hand before she had fully secured her position. The woman who had entered First National Trust Bank that rainy morning after Charles's birthday dinner was not the same one who now stood in the bedroom of the Harrington estate, preparing for battle. That woman had been defeated, diminished by years of subtle cruelty. This woman, the one staring back from the mirror with steel in her gaze, was someone Victoria had never truly met, and she was about to. Richard Kingsley's office became my war room over the next 6 months. Located in a discreet brownstone building on the quieter end of Westfield's Main Street, the law firm offered both privacy and proximity. I could visit under the guise of volunteer work at the nearby Historical Society, one of the few activities Victoria still permitted, finding it suitably elderly and harmless. "We've compiled quite the case," Richard said during one of our strategy sessions, spreading documents across his mahogany desk. Silver-haired and impeccably dressed, he'd developed a protective attitude toward me that reminded me of Charles. Victoria's background checks revealed some fascinating inconsistencies. I leaned forward, examining the papers he'd arranged. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "For starters, Victoria Harrington doesn't exist, at least not before 8 years ago." He tapped a document bearing an unfamiliar name. "Meet Vanessa Schultz from Akron, Ohio. Waitress, occasional model, and person of interest in a real estate fraud investigation that mysteriously went cold." The photographs showed a younger Victoria. Same striking features, but harder somehow. Her blonde hair several shades darker, her expression lacking the polished veneer she now wore like armor. "She reinvented herself completely," Richard continued. "New name, new background, new social circle. The Victoria who claims old money and elite education is entirely fictional." This revelation, while shocking, made certain things clearer. Her intense focus on appearances, her contempt for anything she deemed provincial, her relentless social climbing. Victoria wasn't born to wealth. She had clawed her way into it through reinvention and ultimately marriage to my son. "Does Daniel know?" I asked, the question that had haunted me since we began unraveling Victoria's deceptions. Richard's expression turned grave. "That's the question, isn't it? Is he a victim of her manipulation or a willing accomplice?" The private investigator Richard had engaged produced additional evidence suggesting Victoria had targeted Daniel deliberately, researching the Harrington family well before their chance meeting at a Manhattan gallery opening. She had crafted herself into exactly the sophisticated, cosmopolitan woman she believed would appeal to him, a stark contrast to his first wife, who had been warm and unpretentious. "Your son may have been the mark initially," Richard suggested carefully, "but at some point he became a participant." This was the painful truth I struggled to accept. Whatever Victoria's original scheme, Daniel had evolved from unwitting pawn to active collaborator. The financial evidence Thomas had gathered painted a disturbing picture of joint efforts to liquidate family assets, establish offshore accounts, and systematically divert funds away from legitimate family holdings. "They've been moving money through a series of shell companies," Thomas explained during one of our clandestine meetings at Richard's office. "Primarily luxury real estate purchases that are then leveraged for loans, creating a complex web that's difficult to untangle without proper forensic accounting. Which is exactly why we've engaged Miss Patel," Richard added, nodding toward the sharp-eyed forensic accountant who had joined our team. Divya Patel specialized in high-net-worth family disputes and had the rare ability to translate Byzantine financial maneuvers into comprehensible terms. "They're burning through capital at an unsustainable rate," she explained, presenting charts that tracked the family trust's diminishing resources. The spending accelerated significantly about 18 months ago, coinciding with their Hamptons property purchase and Victoria's increased withdrawal patterns. What emerged was a picture not just of extravagance, but of desperation. Victoria and Daniel weren't simply living beyond their means. They appeared to be extracting as much wealth as possible before some undefined deadline. "It's as if they're preparing for something," Divya observed. "This isn't just poor financial management. It's methodical extraction." Richard's expression darkened, which makes the attempt to remove you from the house even more concerning. "What exactly are they planning that requires your absence?" The question hung ominously in the air. Whatever Victoria's endgame, it clearly involved the complete erasure of my presence in rights within the family. The retirement community deposit wasn't kindness. It was strategic elimination. My response needed to be equally strategic. With Richard's guidance, I began establishing safeguards that Victoria could not easily dismantle. My personal accounts, the independence fund Charles had presciently created, were moved to a different bank entirely, one where Victoria had no connections. I executed a new will with Richard as executor rather than Daniel, ensuring Olivia's inheritance would be protected regardless of her parents' actions. Most importantly, I filed legal documents challenging any potential guardianship proceedings, including statements from my doctor, confirming my mental competence, and testimonials from former colleagues attesting to my continued intellectual acuity. "We're creating a fortress around you," Richard explained. "If they try to claim you're incompetent or unable to manage your affairs, they'll hit a wall of contrary evidence." This legal fortification provided some security, but the emotional fortress proved more difficult to build. Each day in the Harrington estate, watching Victoria and Daniel dismantle my life piece by piece, required a level of performance I'd never imagined myself capable of. I had to appear increasingly defeated, acquiescent to their plans for my relocation, while secretly documenting every conversation and action that might strengthen our case. The small recording device Richard had provided became my constant companion, concealed in specially altered pockets or disguised as an ornamental brooch. Victoria, convinced of her total dominance, grew increasingly careless in her statements. "Once we get her settled in that retirement place, we can finally move forward with the renovation plans," she told Daniel one evening when they thought I was napping in my sitting room. The recording captured every word. "The developer needs to start preliminary work by September if we want to meet the conversion deadline." "What about the historical designation?" Daniel asked, his voice lowered but still audible. "Mom's always been adamant about preserving the estate's original structure." Victoria's laugh was cold. "The historical designation is being handled. My contact at the zoning board assures me it can be overturned with the right persuasion. Besides, once the property transfers fully to our names, Eleanor's preferences become irrelevant." The conversation confirmed our suspicions. They planned not just to redecorate, but to fundamentally alter the Harrington estate, possibly converting it to commercial use despite its historical protection. the home that had sheltered generations of my family, that held memories in every corner, was nothing but a potential revenue source to them. Each new revelation strengthened my resolve, but also deepened the wound of Daniel's betrayal. How had my son, the boy who had once shown such sensitivity, who had wept at his father's funeral with genuine grief, become this calculating stranger? Victoria's influence was undeniable, but could it truly have transformed him so completely? I found a partial answer through an unexpected source. Dr. Evelyn Montgomery, my former colleague from Westfield College and now a practicing psychologist, offered insights after reviewing the evidence I'd gathered. This pattern suggests something called narcissistic collusion, she explained during one of our private meetings at her discreet office suite. Victoria displays classic traits of narcissistic personality: the need for admiration, lack of empathy, sense of entitlement. But Daniel's role is equally important to understand. He's what we sometimes call the enabler or supporter in the dynamic. But why? I asked, the question that haunted my sleepless nights. Why would he participate in this systematic cruelty toward his own mother? Evelyn's expression was compassionate but unflinching. There are several possibilities. He may have underlying resentments that Victoria identified and exploited. He might fear abandonment if he doesn't participate in her schemes. Or perhaps most likely, he receives secondary benefits from the arrangement: status, wealth, a sense of power he hasn't experienced before. The analysis made intellectual sense, but did little to ease the emotional pain. Whatever psychological mechanism explained Daniel's behavior, the result remained the same. My son had become complicit in my destruction. As summer transitioned to early fall, Victoria's timeline accelerated. The suggested move to the retirement community became a firm deadline, October 15th, coinciding with what would have been Charles's birthday. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Victoria seemed to take particular pleasure in selecting dates that would maximize emotional impact. "We've already arranged the movers," she informed me over breakfast, sliding a glossy brochure across the table. "You're only permitted to bring selected personal items. The apartment is fully furnished." I examined the brochure with feigned resignation. The Westfield Seniors Village looked pleasant enough from the photographs. Tidy apartments with safety features, community rooms for structured activities, visiting nurses for residents requiring additional care. It wasn't objectively terrible, which made Victoria's scheme all the more insidious. She wasn't sending me to some neglectful facility where abuse would be evident. She was relegating me to a perfectly adequate warehouse for the elderly, where I would slowly fade from relevance and memory. "How thoughtful," I murmured, using the phrase that had become my standard response to their machinations. "I suppose I should begin sorting my belongings." Victoria smiled triumphantly, already mentally redecorating my rooms. "Don't worry about taking too much. You won't have the space, and honestly, most of those old things should probably be donated." Old things meaning Charles's books, our photograph albums, the artifacts of a life she found inconvenient to her narrative. Each item she casually suggested discarding represented a memory she was attempting to erase, not just from the house, but from family history itself. I nodded placidly while calculating exactly how many days there remained before our counteroffensive would launch. Richard had set our timeline to align with the quarterly meeting of the First National Trust Bank Board, a meeting where Thomas would present evidence of financial impropriety directly to the bank's leadership and legal team. "Timing is crucial," Richard had emphasized during our last strategy session. "We need all elements in place before making our move. Once we act, Victoria will respond aggressively." The pieces were indeed falling into place. Divya had completed her forensic accounting, identifying nearly 3.7 million in questionable transactions from the family trust. Thomas had documented multiple instances where Victoria had attempted to access my personal accounts using forged authorizations. The private investigator had compiled a comprehensive dossier on Vanessa Schultz and her previous legal entanglements, including sealed records that required careful judicial intervention to obtain. Most significantly, Richard had secured a temporary injunction preventing any disposition of the Harrington estate without court approval, filed under seal to prevent Victoria from being forewarned. The Historical Society, alerted to the potential threat to one of Westfield's architectural treasures, had simultaneously filed for enhanced protected status for the property. My performance during these final weeks required extraordinary discipline. I began gradually moving items of genuine sentimental value to secure storage without Victoria noticing their absence. Small keepsakes, irreplaceable photographs, Charles's personal papers. These treasures were smuggled out in Margaret's tote bag during our book club meetings, or carried by Olivia to Richard's office under the pretense of internship work. Olivia had become increasingly aware that something significant was unfolding, though I carefully limited her involvement to protect her position between warring family factions. "Grandma," she whispered one afternoon while helping me sort through desk drawers, "you're not really going to that retirement place, are you?" I studied my granddaughter's face, so like Charles's in moments of serious contemplation, and decided she deserved a measure of honesty. "I'm exploring all my options, dear one. Sometimes situations aren't exactly as they appear." Her relief was palpable. "Good, because it's wrong what they're doing. Dad's different now. He doesn't even seem like himself anymore." This insight from a 16-year-old struck me profoundly. Olivia had identified what I struggled to reconcile: the discontinuity between the son I had raised and the man who now participated in my systematic humiliation. Perhaps the real Daniel was still there somewhere, submerged beneath Victoria's influence. With 1 week remaining before the scheduled move, Victoria's behavior became increasingly erratic. She vacillated between saccharine concern about my transition to the retirement community and barely concealed impatience with the process. During a dinner with potential investors for whatever scheme they had planned for the estate, she became visibly agitated when I mentioned Charles's architectural preservation efforts. "Eleanor is so charmingly stuck in the past," she interjected, her smile tight. "The Harrington estate is entering an exciting new chapter. We're in discussions with several prestigious developers about a boutique hotel concept that would honor the historical elements while bringing the property into the modern era." The investors, men in expensive suits with calculating eyes, nodded appreciatively, already envisioning the returns on such a venture. One of them, a silver-haired gentleman with a New York accent, glanced at me with something like pity. "And you're comfortable with this transition, Mrs. Harrington?" he asked, perhaps the only moment of genuine concern I'd encountered during the entire dinner. Before I could answer, Victoria laughed lightly. "Mother Harrington is relocating to a wonderful retirement community. At her age, managing such a large property becomes overwhelming. Isn't that right, Eleanor?" All eyes turned to me, Victoria's sharp with warning, Daniel's carefully averted, the investors politely curious. In that moment, I could have revealed everything, could have informed these potential partners that their investment might soon be entangled in substantial legal complications. But strategic patience had become my strongest weapon. "Change is inevitable," I replied neutrally, watching Victoria's shoulders relax slightly at what she interpreted as acquiescence. The evening concluded with handshakes and promises of follow-up meetings that would never occur if our plan succeeded. As the investors departed, Victoria's triumph was palpable. She believed herself on the cusp of complete victory, the troublesome mother-in-law removed, the historic estate converted to a profitable venture, her reinvented identity secure from scrutiny. What Victoria didn't know, couldn't possibly suspect, was that I had been wearing the recording device throughout dinner, capturing every detail of the development plan she had never formally disclosed to any regulatory body. The proposed hotel conversion violated multiple zoning regulations and historical preservation statutes, violations that Richard assured me would trigger immediate regulatory intervention once brought to the proper authorities. That night, as I carefully transferred the recording to a secure digital file for Richard, I felt an unexpected emotion amid the tension and anticipation. Not satisfaction or vindication, though those elements were present, but profound sadness. The elaborate legal and financial safeguards we had constructed represented the complete breakdown of what should have been life's most fundamental relationship, the bond between mother and child. Whatever the outcome of our counter-offensive, whatever justice might be achieved, that essential loss could never be fully restored. Daniel had made choices that transcended ordinary family disagreements. He had participated in a systematic campaign to diminish and discard me. Whether through Victoria's manipulation or his own moral weakness, he had betrayed not just me, but the values Charles and I had centered our lives around: integrity, loyalty, compassion. As I closed my bedroom door that night, securing the lock Victoria didn't know I'd had installed, I touched the necklace at my throat, the simple silver pendant bearing the word serenity that Victoria had so often mocked as old-fashioned. The necklace had been Charles's last gift to me, chosen with characteristic thoughtfulness, because you've always found your strength in quiet moments, he had explained as I opened the velvet box on our final anniversary together. Serenity isn't weakness, Eleanor. It's power distilled to its purest form. I hadn't fully understood his meaning then. Now preparing for the battle ahead while projecting an image of defeated acquiescence, I comprehended exactly what Charles had tried to tell me. Serenity wasn't passive acceptance, but the calm certainty that comes from knowing your own mind and choosing your moment. Victoria had mistaken my serenity for weakness. In 3 days' time, when our carefully orchestrated legal and financial interventions activated simultaneously, she would discover her error. The necklace that had been the subject of her derision would become the symbol of her downfall. For serenity wasn't just a platitude etched in silver. It was the code name for the secure account where I had stored every piece of evidence documenting her systematic campaign of elder abuse, financial fraud, and identity deception. The woman who had spent years humiliating me was about to learn the cost of underestimating an adversary who had nothing left to lose. The annual charity gala at the grand ballroom of the Hamilton Hotel had been Westfield's premier social event for decades. Charles and I had attended faithfully each year, supporting causes ranging from educational scholarships to historical preservation. After his death, I had continued the tradition, finding comfort in the familiar rituals of community philanthropy. This year, however, Victoria had regretfully informed the organizing committee that I would not be attending, another small erasure in her campaign to remove me from Westfield's social consciousness. Eleanor is focusing on her transition to assisted living, she had explained with practiced concern. The excitement might be too much for her. What Victoria didn't know, couldn't have suspected, was that I had personally called Josephine Hamilton, the event's longtime chairwoman and my friend of 30 years, to discuss a special request. "Of course you'll be speaking, Eleanor," Josephine had assured me after hearing my proposal. "I'll place you right after the main fundraising appeal. Victoria won't know until it's too late to intervene." The evening of the gala arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp and clear, with just enough chill in the air to justify the furs and wraps that would adorn Westfield's elite. Victoria had spent the day at her salon, returning with freshly highlighted hair and a facial glow that spoke of expensive treatments. Daniel had collected his tuxedo from the dry cleaner, adjusting his cufflinks with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed himself ascending to new social heights. "We should leave by 7, Victoria instructed him as she applied her lipstick in the hallway mirror. "The Reynolds are bringing potential investors for the hotel project. I want plenty of time to work the room before dinner." Neither of them had bothered to say goodbye to me. In their minds, I was already gone, a ghost lingering briefly before being exorcised to the Westfield Seniors Village in 3 days' time. What they also hadn't noticed was my own preparation. The elegant navy gown laid out in my room, the sapphire earrings Charles had given me on our 30th anniversary, the small clutch purse containing not just essential cosmetics, but a USB drive with copies of every incriminating document we had gathered. While Victoria had indulged in beauty treatments, I had visited Richard's office for final preparations, met with Thomas to confirm the bank's intervention was ready, and stopped briefly at the police station, where Detective James Sullivan, another longtime family friend, had updated me on his department's involvement. At 6:30, long after Victoria and Daniel had departed, Margaret arrived at the service entrance, driving her sensible Volvo sedan. "Ready for your grand entrance?" she asked, as I slid into the passenger seat, careful not to wrinkle my gown. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, touching the serenity necklace at my throat. Margaret reached across to squeeze my hand. "Charles would be so proud of you, Eleanor." standing up for yourself, for him, for what's right. We arrived at the Hamilton Hotel through a side entrance Josephine had arranged specifically to ensure Victoria wouldn't spot me before the appropriate moment. From a small antechamber adjacent to the ballroom, I could hear the familiar sounds of Westfield's social elite in full swing. The clink of champagne glasses, the orchestra playing tasteful classics, the rise and fall of conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. Peering through a discreet opening in the door, I spotted Victoria immediately, resplendent in a crimson gown that must have cost thousands, working her way through influential guests with practiced charm. Daniel orbited nearby, less confident in his socializing, but clearly enjoying the reflected prestige of his wife's popularity. They looked like the perfect power couple, wealthy, attractive, poised to ascend to the pinnacle of Westfield society. The image might have been intimidating if I hadn't known what lay beneath it: the fabricated identity, the financial fraud, the calculated cruelty. Victoria's carefully constructed facade was minutes away from shattering, and she had no idea. Josephine appeared at my side, elegant in midnight blue with her signature pearls. They're about to serve the main course. I've scheduled you to speak just before dessert. That's when everyone is most attentive. She studied my face with concern. Are you certain about this, Eleanor? There's no going back once you take that microphone. I've lived with no going back for 7 years, I replied steadily. Since the day Victoria entered our lives and began systematically destroying everything Charles and I built, today is simply the day I stop allowing it. The next hour passed in a blur of anticipation. I watched from my hidden vantage point as dinner was served, as Victoria held court at her table, as Daniel laughed too loudly at some joke from a potential investor. I observed Olivia, seated at a table with other teenagers whose parents had purchased tickets, checking her phone periodically, waiting for the signal we had arranged. Finally, Josephine approached the podium for the evening's fundraising appeal. With practiced elegance, she outlined the charitable initiatives being supported, announced the evening's impressive donation total, and then paused dramatically. Before we move to dessert, we have a special presentation from someone who embodies the spirit of Westfield's commitment to community and integrity. Please welcome to the stage Mrs. Eleanor Harrington. The room's reaction was immediate, a ripple of confused murmurs, heads turning toward Victoria and Daniel's table, where my daughter-in-law had frozen mid-sip of her champagne. Daniel's face had drained of color, his expression oscillating between confusion and alarm. Neither had expected this deviation from Victoria's carefully managed narrative. As I walked toward the podium, back straight and head high, the murmurs intensified. I could hear fragments of whispered conversations. Thought she was in a nursing home already. Victoria said she wasn't well enough to attend. Looks perfectly fine to me. Victoria half rose from her seat, clearly intending to intercept me, but Thomas Reynolds, strategically seated at a nearby table, engaged her with a question that required her attention. By the time she extracted herself, I had reached the podium and adjusted the microphone. "Good evening, friends and neighbors," I began, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Many of you may be surprised to see me here tonight. Some of you may have heard that I'm unwell, confused, or already transitioning to assisted living. I paused, allowing my gaze to sweep across the room before settling directly on Victoria. Those rumors, like so many things in life, are not quite what they appear to be. The ballroom had fallen completely silent now, 200 of Westfield's most influential citizens collectively holding their breath. Victoria remained standing, her crimson gown making her look like a flame frozen in place, her expression a mixture of fury and dawning fear. "I've been a part of this community for over 40 years, I continued. Charles and I built our lives here, raised our son here, contributed to the institutions and traditions that make Westfield special. After Charles passed, I found solace in those same community bonds." My voice caught slightly at the mention of Charles, and I saw several older guests, those who had known us as a couple for decades, nod in understanding. Unfortunately, in recent years, I've experienced something that many elderly individuals face, but few discuss openly: systematic elder abuse, financial exploitation, and calculated social isolation. The gasps were audible. Victoria took a step toward the podium, but Richard Kingsley, who had been waiting for his cue, smoothly moved to block her path. Daniel remained seated, seemingly paralyzed by the unfolding scenario. For 7 years, I have endured escalating humiliation, witnessed the dismantling of my home and history, and ultimately faced attempts to declare me incompetent and remove me from the house that has been in my family for generations. All while significant family assets were being diverted through various shell companies and offshore accounts. I gestured toward the back of the ballroom where Detective Sullivan had entered with 2 uniformed officers, positioning themselves near the main doors. Several dark-suited individuals from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had also appeared, having been briefed on the case by Richard and Thomas. Tonight, that ends. With deliberate movements, I removed a document from my clutch and unfolded it on the podium. This is a federal warrant authorizing the investigation of Victoria and Daniel Harrington for multiple financial crimes, including wire fraud, money laundering, and elder financial abuse. The reaction was immediate. Shocked exclamations, people turning to stare at Victoria and Daniel, phones discreetly emerging to capture what was quickly becoming the most dramatic moment in recent Westfield social history. Victoria had finally unfrozen, her face contorting with rage as she attempted to push past Richard toward the podium. "She's confused!" Victoria shouted, desperately trying to salvage her narrative. "This is exactly what we've been dealing with. These delusional episodes. Daniel, tell them!" All eyes turned to my son, waiting for him to support his wife's claims. But Daniel remained silent, the color continuing to drain from his face as he finally comprehended the full scope of what was unfolding. "I am not confused," I stated clearly, my voice amplified throughout the ballroom, as my medical records and cognitive assessments clearly demonstrate. What I am is determined to protect what remains of my family's legacy from those who sought to destroy it. I turned slightly, nodding to Olivia, who had moved to stand near the side of the stage. My granddaughter's expression was solemn but resolute as she joined me at the podium. With the support of legal counsel, banking authorities, and law enforcement, I have documented a pattern of abuse and financial misconduct that will shock this community. But perhaps most shocking is the discovery that the woman you know as Victoria Harrington is actually Vanessa Schultz, a former waitress from Akron with multiple identity fraud investigations in her past. The screens flanking the stage, normally used for the charity's promotional videos, suddenly illuminated with Victoria's mugshot from a 2013 arrest, alongside documentation of her name change and falsified background. The technical aspects had been arranged by Olivia, who had inherited her grandfather's facility with technology. Victoria's scream of rage cut through the stunned silence of the ballroom. "You vindictive old bitch! You have no idea who you're dealing with!" Her public mask had completely slipped, revealing the vicious character beneath. Several guests physically recoiled from her table, social instincts immediately registering that association with the Harringtons had instantly become toxic. "On the contrary," I replied calmly, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and so now does everyone else." Detective Sullivan and his officers began moving toward Victoria, who was now frantically gathering her purse and wrap, clearly intending to flee. Daniel remained seated, his expression having shifted from shock to a hollow resignation that suggested he had known, on some level, that this day would eventually come. "Federal agents are currently executing search warrants at the Harrington estate and several properties registered to your shell companies," I continued, maintaining my composed demeanor despite the chaos beginning to unfold. "The family trust has been frozen pending full forensic accounting, and the Historical Society has secured an emergency injunction preventing any modification to the estate's structure." As Victoria attempted to push through the crowd toward an exit, she found her path blocked by uniform officers. When she turned to find another escape route, FBI agents were already approaching from the opposite direction. The choreography of her apprehension had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that she had once applied to humiliating me at social gatherings. "Daniel Harrington," Detective Sullivan announced formally, approaching my son's table, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, financial elder abuse, an embezzlement from a family trust. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning continued as Daniel was held to his feet, his expression vacant as handcuffs were applied. He offered no resistance, not even when led past the podium where I stood watching the son I had raised being taken into custody for crimes against his own family. Victoria did not go as quietly. Her screams and accusations echoed through the ballroom as officers restrained her, her crimson gown making the scene appear almost operatic in its dramatic intensity. "She's lying! She's mentally unfit! I want my lawyer! Do you know who I am?" "That's precisely the problem, Ms. Schultz," Detective Sullivan replied, emphasizing her real name. "We now know exactly who you are." As they were led from the ballroom, a profound silence descended over the assembled guests. 200 of Westfield's elite had just witnessed the most spectacular fall from social grace in the community's history. The stunned expressions surrounding me reflected not just shock at the arrests, but the dawning realization that they had been complicit. Through their silence, their acceptance of Victoria's narrative about my declining capacity, their willingness to look away from increasingly obvious signs of elder abuse. "I did not take this action lightly," I said into the silence, my voice softer now that the immediate drama had concluded. "For years, I endured private and public humiliation rather than disrupt my family. I watched as my son became someone I no longer recognized. I felt my late husband's memory and legacy being systematically erased. Tears threatened, but I blinked them back. This moment required strength, not emotion. But there comes a point where silence becomes complicity in one's own destruction, where allowing abuse to continue unchallenged damages not just yourself, but the very community values we gather here tonight to support." I removed the Serenity necklace, holding it up so the silver pendant caught the light. "My husband gave me this before he passed." Victoria mocked it repeatedly as old-fashioned, an old woman's trinket. What she never knew was that Serenity became the code name for the secure account, where every piece of evidence against her was methodically collected and preserved. Looking around the room, I could see many guests nodding in understanding, particularly the older women who had perhaps experienced their own versions of diminishment and dismissal based on age. The Harrington estate will remain what it has always been, a family home and a historical treasure in this community. The foundation Charles established will continue supporting educational initiatives, and I paused, allowing myself a small smile. "Will not be moving to Westfield Seniors Village next week after all." A ripple of nervous laughter broke the tension, followed by something I hadn't anticipated: applause. It began tentatively near the back of the room, but quickly spread until the entire ballroom was filled with the sound of hundreds of hands coming together in spontaneous support. As I stepped away from the podium, Josephine embraced me tightly. "That," she whispered, "was the most extraordinary moment I've witnessed in 40 years of these galas." Margaret was there next, tears streaming unashamedly down her face. "You did it, Eleanor. You actually did it." Thomas Reynolds approached with a group of banking executives, all solemn with the realization of what had transpired under their institutional watch. "The board extends its deepest apologies, Mrs. Harrington. Rest assured, we will cooperate fully with all investigations." For the next hour, I remained at the gala, accepting expressions of support and, in some cases, apologies from community members who recognized their failure to intervene. Richard worked the room professionally, deflecting inappropriate questions and ensuring that well-wishers didn't overwhelm me. Finally, as the evening wound down and guests began departing, no doubt eager to dissect the dramatic events over nightcaps and phone calls, Olivia approached, her young face serious beyond her years. "Can I come home with you tonight, Grandma?" she asked quietly. "I don't think I can face the house alone, knowing what's happening with Mom and Dad." I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. This child caught in the crossfire of adult betrayals and consequences. "Of course, dear one. The Harrington estate is your home too. It always will be." As we left through the main entrance, no more side doors or hidden approaches, several reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the arrests called out questions. Richard smoothly intervened, promising a formal statement in the morning but ensuring our passage to Margaret's waiting car. The drive back to the estate was quiet, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts about the evening's events and what would follow. When we arrived, the property was still bustling with law enforcement activity. Lights blazing from windows, official vehicles in the circular drive, officers carrying boxes of documents and electronic devices. Detective Sullivan met us at the door. "Mrs. Harrington, we've secured the premises and collected the evidence outlined in our warrants. You're free to enter your home, though some areas remain active investigation scenes." "Thank you, Detective," I replied, suddenly weary now that the adrenaline was fading. "We'll manage." Olivia gripped my hand as we walked through the front door, both of us processing the strange new reality. The Harrington estate was still physically the same building we had left hours earlier, but everything had changed. Victoria's presence, oppressive and omnipresent for 7 years, had been excised, leaving behind a curious emptiness that felt like both loss and liberation. In the grand entrance hall, beneath the portrait of Charles that Victoria had repeatedly threatened to remove, I paused to absorb the moment. Justice had been served, yes. The systematic campaign to humiliate and erase me had been not just halted but exposed and punished. The family legacy would be preserved, the financial damage eventually repaired, but the cost had been immeasurable. My son, whatever his motivations or level of culpability, was now facing criminal charges and public disgrace. The family name that Charles had worn with such quiet dignity was now associated with fraud and elder abuse in news headlines across the region, and Olivia would carry the complicated burden of knowing her grandmother had been forced to take legal action against her parents. "Was it worth it?" Olivia asked softly, seeming to read my thoughts as we stood in the suddenly quiet house. I considered the question carefully, owing her the honesty that had been in such short supply in her young life. "Worth is a difficult calculation," I finally replied, touching the empty space at my throat where the serenity pendant had rested for years. "But dignity is not negotiable. Neither is truth. Your grandfather understood that, and I hope someday your father will remember it too." We climbed the stairs slowly, bypassing Victoria's wing with its modern renovations, and returning to the east wing she had so recently planned to convert. In my sitting room, still intact with Charles's books and our shared mementos, I felt a profound sense of reclamation. Not triumph exactly, but restoration. Victoria had spent years humiliating me, attempting to erase me from my own life, while my son watched with inexplicable satisfaction. Their campaign had been sophisticated, patient, and very nearly successful. What they hadn't accounted for was the quiet strength Charles had always recognized in me, the serenity that comes not from passivity, but from absolute certainty in one's own value and truth. In the end, it wasn't just the bank I had called that rainy Tuesday night. It was my own power, dormant but never destroyed, answering when I finally had the courage to summon it. Looking back now, from the peace of the restored Harrington estate, I can hardly believe the journey I've traveled. 6 months have passed since that night at the Grand Ballroom when justice was finally served. The legal proceedings continue. Victoria remains in custody, denied bail due to flight risk, while Daniel was eventually released under house arrest at a modest apartment across town. The financial investigations uncovered even more extensive fraud than we initially suspected, with nearly $5.2 million diverted through their elaborate network of shell companies. But numbers can't capture the true story. The true story is about power, how it can be taken from you so gradually that you barely notice its absence until you're standing in your own home feeling like a trespasser. It's about the insidious nature of emotional abuse, how it erodes your confidence and identity until you question your own perceptions. And ultimately, it's about reclamation, finding the strength to take back what was stolen from you, piece by precious piece. When Victoria first entered our lives, I was still grieving Charles. Perhaps that made me vulnerable, eager to welcome someone who seemed to make my son happy. I overlooked the early warning signs, her subtle criticisms, her territorial behavior regarding the house, her dismissive attitude toward family traditions. By the time I recognized the pattern, she had already established her narrative. Eleanor, the doddering widow, gradually losing her faculties, an inconvenient relic to be managed and eventually removed. What Victoria never understood What ultimately led to her downfall was that appearances can be deceiving. Behind my acquiescent exterior, I was observing, documenting, and gradually building the case that would expose her true identity and intentions. The recording device concealed in my old-fashioned brooch captured conversations she never imagined would be heard by others. The quiet meetings with Richard Kingsley built legal protections she couldn't penetrate. The Serenity account she mocked became the repository of evidence that would eventually lead to her arrest. There's a particular satisfaction in using an opponent's underestimation against them. Victoria believed me technologically inept, financially naive, socially irrelevant. She never suspected that the woman she humiliated at dinner parties and community events was methodically orchestrating her destruction, building alliances with bankers, lawyers, and law enforcement while maintaining the facade of defeated compliance. I won't pretend the victory came without cost. The most painful aspect remains Daniel's involvement. Psychiatric evaluations conducted since his arrest suggest a complex dynamic of manipulation and dependency in his relationship with Victoria. There are indications that she systematically isolated him from former friends and colleagues, creating an environment where her approval became his primary source of validation. This doesn't excuse his actions. He made choices that caused profound harm, but it helps me understand how my son became unrecognizable to me. Olivia has struggled with the aftermath, as any child would when their family implodes so publicly. She's living with me now, finishing her senior year at Westfield High School with the support of counseling and a small circle of loyal friends. We have difficult conversations about loyalty, accountability, and the complicated truth that people we love can sometimes do terrible things. I see Charles in her thoughtful questions and her determination to understand rather than simply judge. She visits Daniel weekly, but has refused all contact with Victoria, a boundary I've encouraged her to maintain. The Harrington estate itself has been restored to its former character. Victoria's cold modernist renovations have been reversed. Charles's books returned to library shelves, family photographs restored to their places of honor. The development scheme for converting the property to a boutique hotel was permanently halted when the Historical Society secured enhanced protected status for the building and grounds. Ironically, using Victoria's recorded statements about circumventing preservation regulations as evidence of the threat. I've established a foundation focused on combating elder abuse and financial exploitation, using a portion of the recovered funds. The foundation provides legal assistance to vulnerable seniors and educational programs for financial institutions and law enforcement agencies. If some good can come from our family's painful experience, perhaps it helps balance the ledger somewhat. As for me, at 66, I've rediscovered aspects of myself that had been suppressed during Victoria's reign. I've rejoined the college's alumni board, resumed my research on early American women's literature, and even started teaching a seminar for adult learners at the community center. The Eleanor that Victoria tried to erase, the professor, the community leader, the woman of substance and opinion, has re-emerged, stronger for having endured the attempt at her obliteration. I share this story not from a place of vengeance, but of warning. Elder abuse doesn't always look like physical neglect or obvious financial theft. Sometimes it wears designer clothes and a charming smile, gradually isolating you from support systems, subtly undermining your confidence, systematically erasing your autonomy until you find yourself a stranger in your own life. If my experience helps even one person recognize these patterns and find the courage to resist, then the painful retelling serves a purpose. But I won't pretend there isn't satisfaction in remembering Victoria's face as the officers led her from the ballroom, her carefully constructed facade crumbling in real time as Westfield's elite witnessed her true nature emerge. Sometimes justice arrives in unexpected moments, wearing unexpected faces. Sometimes the person dismissed as powerless proves to be the most formidable opponent of all. If you've stayed with me through this story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Sharing these painful experiences hasn't been easy, but your support makes it worthwhile. This is why I'm asking you to subscribe to Revenge Expected if you haven't already. Each subscription helps our channel reach more people who might be experiencing similar situations or who simply appreciate stories of justice eventually being served. The work that goes into creating these videos is substantial, from researching and writing to filming and editing. It's a labor of love, but it does require resources. If you found value in my story and want to support the channel in a more tangible way, please consider using the Super Thanks feature. Your financial contribution, no matter how small, helps cover the costs of production and allows us to bring you new stories daily. It truly makes a difference in our ability to continue this work. I also encourage you to leave a comment below. What would you have done in my situation? Do you think my actions were justified? Have you witnessed or experienced similar patterns of manipulation? Your engagement not only helps the channel grow through the algorithm, but creates a community where these important discussions can flourish. I read every single comment, and your perspectives matter deeply to me. Don't forget to like this video if you found it valuable. That simple action significantly impacts how many others will have the opportunity to hear this story. And please, take a moment to check out the other videos on the Revenge Expected channel. Each one features a unique first-person account of justice being served after prolonged mistreatment. Stories that might resonate with your own experiences or provide insight into situations faced by people you care about. I'll be reading your comments and look forward to engaging with you in that space. Your support means everything to me and to the Revenge Expected channel. Together, we're creating awareness about hidden forms of abuse while celebrating the resilience of those who eventually find ways to reclaim their power. Thank you for listening to my story. Sometimes life forces us to become warriors when we'd rather remain peacemakers. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing alone, at least temporarily. But as I discovered in that ballroom on that fateful night, once you find the courage to speak your truth, you rarely remain alone for long. Until next time, remember that serenity isn't weakness. It's power in its most patient, enduring form.